you want to go back and listen to anything that we said, you can do that. All right. Again, preparing for a successful grazing season. And in thinking about this, you know, we're coming up, spring's a little over a month away. It was less or more than that when I was, you know, kind of thinking about this presentation. But there's a lot of, obviously, downtime. You still got chores and such, but time more to think during the non-grazing season about how you want to improve your system for the next year. So figured let's talk through some tools that are available to you to do that while it is still cold and wet outside. I broke it up into 5 things, and let's just go ahead and take a look at those. So the first one is taking stock, just inventorying, evaluating what you have right now. Talking about the condition of your pastures, the condition of your infrastructure, evaluating animal demand, and then how all those pieces kind of fit together. Using that information then to develop or maybe refine your plan. Maybe you already have a decent plan, but you're just looking to tweak things here and there. But basically, what are you going to do and how are you going to know that it works? And then once you have a plan about how you're going to treat animal demand and pasture production, how do you make sure you have the right nutrients, the right time, in the right place, and the right amount available to grow the forage that you're hoping and expecting. And then we'll finish off with 2 kind of smaller topics, more maybe in the tips and tricks section of things, which I've titled Mow to Grow, just working and understanding grass physiology to keep palatable grass for as long as you can. And similarly, staving off that cliff of production in the summer to get as much production as you can for as long as you can. So without further ado, I guess with a little bit more ado, this won't work too well with the folks on the call, but at least for the folks in the room here, I'm curious on this scale, you know, with one hand up in the air, knowledge level as it pertains to grazing management, where would you place yourself in a continuum like this? Very little knowledge, just starting out, just haven't had livestock before, interested in getting some and trying grazing management, or been doing it for years? In the middle. Everybody's in the middle. 1, okay. Got some ones. That's good. Gwen, did you have something? Okay, we'll go ahead. That helps so that I know where to be more specific and less specific on things as we're going through. So, okay, so the taking stock piece. We're going to talk about the components of your grazing system, but first you got to know what it is that you want to do, right? Contextualize what you have in so far as where you want to be in the next year, 3 years, 5 years. So just really wanted to put a simple plug in there to say, you know, the key to a good grazing plan is setting good goals for what you want to achieve. And in our organization, a lot of other organizations use a really common kind of framework for that called SMART goals. I'm sure folks have heard of it before. The actual acronym seems to change a little bit each time I find a different infographic, but the one I found puts it as specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. The big 3, I think, are the specific, measurable, and timely. Namely, what in particular are you going to do? Not, I want to have better grazing management. Pick something that, one component of that specifically that you want to work on. How are you going to measure whether you've done it or not? That could be numbers. That could be a yes or no question. And then what time frame are we talking about? Is this in the next 50 years? Because that's going to change how you go about planning for it, as opposed to if you're planning to do it in the next 3. So just put some examples there below it so folks have an idea of what that looks like. So the first one there being reduce hay bill by 5% by improving pasture production over the next 3 years. So is that specific? It's pretty specific. We're talking about one thing. We're talking about our hay bill. Is it measurable? yeah, you know how much you're spending on hay, and you've set a percentage target of that you want to meet, or you could just say, I want to reduce my hay bill. And then by improving pasture production over the next 3 years, that's timely. Is it achievable and realistic? That's going to depend on your circumstances, but that would be an example of a SMART goal. Provide enough forage of adequate quality for 20 cow-calf pairs from April to December, basically, is another example. This time we're talking about specific quantity of animals for a specific period of time. That gives you a good sense of what you'll have to do to plan around that. And then once you've gotten to that level, this picture is kind of small, but if it's the way your brain works, you can start to write that down, whether it's in a table, a journal, what have you, and kind of parcel out the costs that are going to be associated with that. Are you going to need more cross fencing? Are you going to need more watering, infrastructure? Are you going to need to address nutrient management, all these individual pieces? And there's a great document. We'll talk a little bit more about the resource. It's back over there, Pasture and Grazing Management in the Northwest. It's a huge resource. Wouldn't necessarily recommend you just go ahead and sit down and read through the whole thing each night, but it's broken up really nicely into sections. So the first section, it deals with planning. They have a specific section on incorporating that plan into your business model. I think the section of that's printed out over there is grazing cell or paddock design. So a lot of really cool resources that are pretty accessible in short chunks. I think the grazing cell design is 10 pages, something like that. So a pretty easy read. The publication is Pasture and Grazing Management in the Northwest. It's, yeah, of sorts. It's a publication out of University of Idaho, Washington State University, and University of Oregon, or Oregon State University, sorry. So, yes.
I have a couple, or just one comment that came remotely. Do you want me to?
Yeah.
Right now?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Just one person who said and this goes back to the knowledge level, that they've been farming for 30 years, but 5 years into pigs and needing some other suggestions.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that a little louder?
Yeah. This person has been farming for 30 years, but only 5 years into pigs and needs some other suggestions. Can you hear that?
I could hear that, yeah. As far as managing pigs on pasture, I would encourage that person to go ahead and put their contact information. Unfortunately, pigs aren't going to be a big focus of the presentation. It's broad enough that there should be good principles to take away, but I'd be happy to follow up with them.
Okay. Another question is if you're going to be repeating the question, sorry, not repeating the question, if you're going to be sending out or making available some of these.
Yes, that's a great point. Yes, I've got a table of resources here, and I typically follow up with an email with all those resources and maybe a few more to folks afterwards, just in case they forgot to grab something or anything of that sort. So yes, I'll send out an email to folks on the webinar as well. Anything else?
Nope.
Okay. So the first piece of that is, or once you have your goals kind of set, the first piece to address is what is the condition of your pasture right now. You can see kind of two examples of that, not to pick on horse people here, but two examples of a relatively well-managed system and a system that could probably do with a little bit of improvement. And not only what condition is your pasture in right now, but think back to what condition it was in last fall. Fall grazing management has a huge impact on the production of the next season and beyond. And that's because September, you know, end of August to beginning of October really is the start of the forage growing season. And so when the rains return, they're setting new roots and setting some new growth that's going to form the foundation of the next spring's growth. So if you're putting it into deficit before it goes into winter and comes out next spring, you're going to really decrease your production. So some questions to ask yourself when you're evaluating your grass season. How was the growing season and forage production? Just how did you feel about it? You can quantify that if you've been doing it long enough, but I think qualitative is probably even just as useful. Did you feel good about it? Did you wish I guess you always wish there was more grass, but were there things that you could have done to achieve that? How did this year's production compare with the last 3 years to kind of establish, are we moving in the right direction, the wrong direction? Does the grazing intensity for each pasture appear to be, more or less correct for what we're trying to do? If it's just an exercise area, that could be completely different than if you're trying to do a managed intensive grazing system. It's one of the reasons I'm not going to get overly specific. It's because all of you are going to have kind of your own situations on that. But the key is knowing what it is that you're trying to do and what you're expecting the grass to do for you in that system. And then the last one there is based on the past year's grazing, which pasture, if any, need lighter grazing. That's pretty key. Where should we maybe decrease our intensity of grazing? That could also go the other way around too, though. If there is forage that you've left on the table and you've had to get out there and mow it, or you've lost it because it's over matured, that could be a sign that you, at least for that period, have some extra capacity to bring on. So pay attention to both of those things. And then the little note there on the bottom is just about a tool. It's on the table back there. It looks like this. And it's a tool that we use in our planning process. It's the Pasture Production Estimate Guide Sheet. And it takes a little bit of know-how to use, but the thing I like about it is that you go through the questions on here, and even if you're not 100% right on each of them, it gives you kind of a rough percentage of your potential that you're currently at. And that gives you a point in time that you can come back and reference later on. And it will also kind of identify those areas. It's broken up into what the stubble height is, what your fertility is, what your grazing system's like, how long are they on there, all of those pieces. And depending on how those score, you can see, oh, I guess I'm really limiting myself because, my grazing system is over 14 days and I'm just eating the regrowth as it's coming on, and the grass is never getting a chance to reestablish. So that may be way farther than you want to go, but the resource is there, or you can reach out to us and we're happy to come out and walk through that tool with you. So not going to spend a lot of time on infrastructure just because it's going to be very different for everybody, but just simple things to consider, and you'll know your system best. But just considering, are there repair needs that I have around fencing or watering, gutters and downspouts, those kind of pieces. Like I mentioned before, depending on what you're trying to do, trying to break up your pastures into more defined grazing units, are you going to need more fence? How much is that going to cost? All of those pieces. So the part that we're going to spend a little bit more time on, I love this picture, is evaluating animal demand. How many folks have done this before? Anybody? Few? Okay. Cool. That's great. Well, it's a good reminder for those folks who have done it. And for folks who haven't and who are just starting out, this is kind of a keystone piece for figuring out how many livestock you can have. So animal demand starts with, how much feed does my herd need? And I feel like I should have a scary noise sound effect here, because this is going to require a little bit of math, but it's it's not too bad. How much feed your herd need is a function of the number of livestock you have, their average weight, and the amount of feed in dry matter that they eat per day. That's basically expressed as a function, usually between 1 and 5%. So they're eating 1% of their body weight per day in feed, whatever that happens to be. Once you have that number figured out for your herd, you can then figure out how much ground that's going to take. And so you use that daily herd intake number that you've come up with. It's going to be modified by your grazing efficiency. That's kind of a stock number. Same with the dry matter intake. This isn't something that you necessarily just have to know off the top of your head. You can find these numbers or talk to us and we can help you find those numbers pretty easily. And then divided by the pounds of dry matter per acre you have out in the field. And that gives you how many acres you need daily for that particular herd. I will say that this works well for all livestock except for really poultry and swine, unfortunately, just because they don't utilize the pasture in the same way that more traditionally grazing animals do. They'll eat grass here and there, but they're really, digging around in the soil and looking for bugs and other pieces that aren't, captured by this. So we're going to walk through an example of this. And the scenario I picked more or less at random was to look at 10 dried dairy cattle, judging by their size, their jerseys. That gets them in about 1,000 pounds, makes the math pretty easy for this. But the process for any animal class is going to be the same. The other worksheet that's back there on the table, and I will send out to folks on the call, is this worksheet, and you see it up here on the screen. It's basically just to help keep you oriented as you walk through all of the equations. I also have an Excel version of this if folks are interested in that, and it's already got the equations, the functions in it, so you can just enter the numbers you need, and it will give you the results without the calculator. So, but we're looking at those 10 dry dairy cattle, and I've given away the answer, but let's walk through what it looks like. So that question of how much feed does my herd need starts with, what does it start with? Anybody? Yeah, number of livestock, right? Yeah. And then the average size of those livestock, and then how much they eat per day as a percentage of their body weight. In this case, it tends to be, or it happens to be 2%. So if we walk through that, very simple math. I looked it up. Yeah, I don't know what a dried Jersey dairy cow. It'll depend on species and then also conditions. So if it was a lactating Jersey cow, they'd be eating a lot more percentage of the body. Same with a growing animal is going to be eating a lot more percentage of its body weight than one that's just maintenance. That goes for horses too. So if you have a really highly exercised horse, they're going to eat more obviously than one that's not so much. So the math is 10 times 1,000, 10,000. Not very scary. And then times 0.02, that's just 2% as a decimal. That gets us to 200 pounds daily dry matter intake for that herd of 10 cows. And did I lose anybody going through that? Okay. So how much ground will that take? This is a little bit more in depth, not too bad, but the 200 on top of the divisional factor there is the daily herd dry matter intake. The 55%, that's another one of those numbers. That's the grazing efficiency that I told you that you could look up. In the worksheet that I have in here on the screen, you can see it down. Where's my cursor? There we go. You can see the kind of the table that this comes out of. And incidentally, the publication that this worksheet came out of is also there on the table over there if you want to look at it. And I can send out which one it is to folks on the call. So you look at I keep losing my cursor. You look at this grazing system utilization table, and it's given you approximate ranges, right? So for a rotation every 2 to 3 days, we're getting roughly 58%. For a rotation every 6 to 8 days, we're getting roughly 50%. And that has to do with trampling, selective grazing, avoiding, well, I guess that goes along with selective grazing, but avoiding fouled forages, and manure, urine, that kind of stuff. And then particularly as you get longer, the grass is starting to regrow, and so they're starting to go back for those regrowth, sweet and tender regrowth. So in this situation, we said 55%, we're somewhere in the middle there. And then to figure out our pasture production, we use the table right next to it. We've got mixed pasture. It's in pretty good condition. So we're going to say it provides 300 pounds per inch per acre of forage. So that means each acre that has an inch on it is 300 pounds. Then because of our grazing system, we know we're going to be taking off about 4 inches. Let's say we're going to start at 8 inches and we're going to graze it down 4 inches. You can multiply those to get 1,200 pounds. So 200 divided by 55% gets you to 363. 300 pounds times 4 gets you to 1,200. There it's super easy. You just divide it and you come out to about 0.3 acres per day to meet that 200 pounds of daily dry matter intake. Now, did I lose anybody? No, okay. So we're going to come back to those numbers in a minute in kind of the next section of the plan, and that's using that information. So the condition of your pastures, which I recommend you be very realistic about, and know what it is that you're trying to do. By that I mean don't expect a pasture that's been grazed down to an inch for several decades to suddenly start producing, 3 tons of forage for you very quickly. So knowing what your pasture condition is, knowing the state of your infrastructure and what you may have to add, and then now knowing what your animals require feed-wise that you can supply during the grazing season. Using that on to develop a grazing plan, there's just a few options of what grazing plans could look like. It could be, a graphical representation. It could be a grazing chart. Really like grazing charts. There's a good example of it later in here that I will show you. I was trying to find one that I could print off, but I didn't get to it. I'll hopefully send that out later. But like I said, there's lots of resources to help you on the journey of developing your plan at whatever scale that you want it to be. It could be bite-sized chunks out of that Pasture and Grazing Management and Northwest Guide. The Western Oregon and Washington Pasture Calendar, which we're going to talk a little bit more about, is another great resource. Tons of extension bulletins out there on various facets of pasture management, whether it's nutrient management, managing hay, renovating, all those pieces. That's where I would recommend you go first, is those land grant university resources that have been, are based on years of research. ATRA, that's just kind of a specific call out. They're a nonprofit that does some nice fact sheets on grazing and a bunch of other topics as well. So they might be a place to look. Of course, industry publications on pasture is a pretty great publication. And then of course, us, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is our sister federal agency, WSU, or any of the other land grant universities in the area. So like I said, we're just gonna take a small detour, talk about the Western Oregon and Western Washington pasture calendar, because it's new. I like the way it's broken down. I don't know that it works for everybody, but I want to highlight it in case folks find that it really works for them. So it came out in 2017. Oregon State University, Washington State University, University of Idaho, and the Natural Resource Conservation Service collaborated to put it together. And basically what it does is it breaks down each growth period, each change in age of growth of your forage grasses into what the grass is doing, what's going on out in the environment, what management you should consider, and what management you should avoid. So looks a little bit like that. I know that that doesn't look automatically that much more helpful, but each of the kind of colored squares over here are a grazing period. They'll make a little bit more sense, or rather a growth period, grass growth period. They'll make a little bit more sense in a second. But as you can see, they roughly correspond to the calendar, and they change slightly depending on where you are geographically, which makes sense, right? So it's a nice, more or less geographically specific resource. So you can see, just looking at this, you can see some difference here between, this is the foothills. So, up in Buckley, for instance, versus down here, down in the valley, the droughty to adequate, that would be the prairie soils more down towards Roy and Yelm and that area. And you can see that they're a little bit different throughout the calendar. Things start a little bit earlier, end a little bit later, those kind of things. So once you start thinking about it that way, I think it becomes a little bit more of a useful tool. And just February is a key month. We'll talk about why that is in a second. So we're not going to spend a ton of time on this. I just want to show you what it looks like, what each of those colored squares actually represents. And so if we go back here, we can see the period 4 goes until, about mid-February. We're just coming out of it. And that's a period of very slow growth. So the grass at this point is pretty dormant, growing slowly, if at all, depending on, soil moisture and temperature and those kind of things. One of the interesting pieces of this time of year, carbohydrate levels are high in the grass. And so if there's a stretch of dry weather and you want to get livestock out, it's going to be a lot harder to manage them out there because the grass is sweeter. And so you may manage the same way, but because of the palatability of the grass, they're responding that much quicker to grazing, number one, because of that and because they've been cooped up for the past 6 months, right? So I think that's useful information. It's useful knowledge. The environmental factors, pretty straightforward. It's cold, it's wet. Management needed, graze only if your soils aren't saturated. Compaction is a really hard issue to overcome, and it's best just to not start it if you haven't already. Start tracking T-sum, which we'll talk a little bit about, and then utilize confinement areas as needed. And things to avoid is basically the converse of that. A little bit more information on environmentally, if you're oversupplying nitrogen at this time, what could happen. And then down below, you can see the dates roughly of when those happen. So as you might expect, it starts a little bit earlier in the foothills, it goes a little bit longer. And between the lowlands and the prairie soils, there's not that much different. We're just coming into period 5, which is a period of increasing growth. So soil temperatures are warming up, the grass is growing, moisture's there. So it's going to start putting on growth. As it's doing that, it's using those carbohydrate reserves, so it's a little bit less palatable, a little bit easier to manage. Still, it's pretty wet, so it'd be hard to get them out on pasture very consistently. You can make your first applications of nutrients here under the management needed section around this time. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that. It's not, February rolled around and Robin said we can go out and spread manure. No, but if you're monitoring average air temperature and cognizant of what the weather is going to do, and if you're close to streams and you can graze the grass that you're going to grow, you could get a start on the season at this point. So again, looking at when it happens, it's a little bit later to start on the foothills, goes a little bit later And again, not a whole lot of difference between the lowland and prairie soils. Last one here, period of rapid growth. So that's the spring flush when grass really starts to grow. Excuse me. Both protein and carbohydrate levels in the forage tend to be lower at this point. And interestingly, you know, you'll hear constantly, we talk about leaving 3 inches at least of stubble when you're grazing. They're recommending even higher than that, 4 to 6 inches of grazing. Part of that we'll talk about some benefits of doing that later on. One just kind of obvious benefit is it takes, you know, roughly the same amount of time, give or take, to grow from 3 inches to 6 inches as it does from 4 inches to 8 inches, or to grow back the half that you may have grazed off. And so if you're starting from a higher grazing point to begin with, a higher stubble height, you're going to get that much more grass. So just something to consider. And then as far as when this period happens, if you're interested in reading into more of the detail, there's a few copies of this over there, and then again I'll send it out. But starts a little bit later, again on the foothills, goes a little bit later. Not a whole lot of difference between lowland and prairie soils. So that's just one example of a resource that you could look into. Doesn't necessarily have to be at that depth, but the information's out there to make informed decisions. So now we're going to come back to the same example that we were working on before with those 10 dry dairy cattle. Now they look suspiciously like sheep, but we're gonna, what happened? I know. Now we're gonna take the average, or the acres we needed per day, and extrapolate that to, okay, how big do my paddocks need to be for how long they're gonna be out there? How many paddocks am I gonna need, you know, based on my grazing system, how many days they're on there, and how many days rest we have, and then roughly how many total acres is that. So I don't think I go through, no, I don't. I saved you the going through the math this time, but you can see the equations at least here. So how big do my paddocks need to be? It's pretty simple. It's how big they need to be per day, or how many acres you need per day to meet that daily herd intake, and then how many days they're gonna be there. So that 0.3 that we came up with before, times 5 days they're going to be on the pasture, comes out to 1.5 acres per paddock. So each grazing unit is going to be roughly 1.5 acres, give or take. So each of the squares that are up here would ideally be 1.5 acres. Some may be a little bit bigger, some may be a little bit smaller. You want to be close. And then from there, we can figure out how many paddocks do we need. And that's a function of the amount of rest we're going to give the pastures. That's going to change throughout the season. Earlier in the season, you're going to need less rest because the grass is going to be growing a lot faster. And then later into the summer, when there's not as much, the soil temps are higher, there's not as much moisture, the grass is going to slow down. You're going to need to get more rest. 30 days is an average. So then plus the 5 days that they're going to be on that one paddock to begin with, divided by 5 days per paddock, gets you to 7. So in this scenario, for those 10 dry cattle, dairy cattle, we're going to want 7 paddocks of about 1.5 acres each to approximately meet their needs during the grazing season for a total of 10 acres, give or take. And I should say, this is not, you're going to run this tool and then you're going to go through a grazing system. You're going to say, well, that wasn't quite right. And yeah, it wasn't quite right. It'll get you in the ballpark. It'll get you a start. But from there, it's up to you to kind of fine tune what the specifics of your soil type and your microclimate and all those little things that'll play into it. But so now we have a grazing system that consists of 7 paddocks that are 1.5 acres each. So we've researched, we kind of planned out what our system's going to look like. What do we do after that? I would strongly suggest that you write it down. And it could be, again, as in-depth as you want to be or as loosey-goosey as you want to be. And I've tried to organize the points kind of in increasing management intensity. I think the very least you should do is write down how long they're going to be on the pasture and at what frequency. So how long are they going to, yeah, you have a question?
Have a certain number of paddocks, and you're moving your fencing and stuff to accommodate that. How do you shift that?
There's a few ways you can do it. We'll talk about one option. I guess I'll just spoil it now. Mowing is one option. So if you're,
Hey, Robin, can you repeat the question?
oh yes, sorry. And now we got the train going by. So hold on one sec. The question was, how do you accommodate the difference in growth periods between early in the season and late in the season when you're planning an average? So when I put down an average rest of 30 days and then immediately said, well, it's never going to be, well, it may be one time in the season exactly 30 days. How do you deal with that? Like I said, you can mow it. So as the grass is getting ahead of you and it's going to go to seed, you could get out there and mow it. It's going to grow back. So that's one way. You could be flexible enough in your management that you're grazing more intensively during those periods, moving more often, getting greater utilization, those kind of things. Yeah.
Robin, I have a question from the phone.
Yes.
Can a newly created and planted spring paddock be graze ready by sometime in the same year?
I'll repeat it, can a newly seeded, they were seeded in the spring, you said?
Yes.
Be ready sometime in the same year?
Yeah.
I would say probably not. The way to check would be to go out and give it the tug test, as they call it, and make sure that when the livestock get out there, they're not going to pull the newly planted grass. It's not established enough yet to really stand up to much grazing intensity. It depends. If you have water or you have, well, probably just if you have irrigation, that would be the biggest mowing. Is that what you're saying, Renee? Renee's sharing her wisdom. Mowing it to get it to put more of its energy into root growth can also speed that process up, but it's going to be tough within that first year, I think. So, anything else, Gwen?
Not yet.
Okay. Next level of intensity would be not just going off of kind of static duration and rest, but really having triggers for when you're going to do things. And by that, I mean, at what height are you going to move the animals on? Is it going to be 6 inches? Is it going to be 8 inches? Is it going to be 12 inches? How much will you take / when will you take them off? So, are you going to take 30%? Are you going to take 50%? Is your stubble height going to be, it should be over 3 inches. And you saw from the pasture calendar, at sometimes the year, it might even have to be more than that. But you want to kind of give yourself that guideline. And then the other thing, this is just a little tidbit, would be to figure out where that is on your boot, maybe. And so as you're walking through the field, you can see really quickly, am I close to 3 inches? Am I way lower than, because you'll always walk through the field if you don't know what 3 inches is. And say, yeah, of course that's 3 inches, that looks good. So, try and give yourself an easy check. And then probably the most important, which is tough sometimes, is when will you choose not to graze? When are you going to say, nope, we're going to move them onto gravel or concrete or whatever you have, sacrifice area, and keep them off the field. Next level, which you should probably do at regardless of how in depth you're going to go, is some level of monitoring. Just how are you going to check that it's working for you? That could just be a simple gut check, could be photos or other tools. And then you can go down a rabbit hole and plan out everything that you're ever going to do. So, when are you going to soil sample? When are you going to apply nutrients? How will you manage your irrigation water if you're lucky enough to have it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So those are just the individual pieces that you can continually add on as you hone things in. So to get you started on those things, just the basics for folks who aren't familiar with it. On the grazing duration and frequency, really recommend less than 5 days per paddock. You can do it. And if you can't, if it's like, oh, but that doesn't fit with my, then I got to keep track of it moving week to week, you could leave them out there for 5 days and then put them in the sacrifice area for 2. That's, that may impact your hay bill, but could also keep you here within this less than 5 days. The reason for less than 5 days is after that, the grass is going to start to regrow. And like I said before, it's like kale versus an ice cream sandwich. One is very sweet and attractive, and the other one is healthy, but not quite as valuable. So don't give your livestock the choice between those two. And then, like I say, rest typically 15 to 45 days, give or take, depending on the conditions. 30 days is a good average to plan around. On the grazing trigger side, did you have a question? No? Okay.
Hey, Robin, there
Yes.
is a question from and this was actually back on your last slide, is
okay.
Do you remove manure from paddocks each time you rotate, harrow, or leave it as it falls?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I guess it would depend on, let me repeat the question back to you. Should you remove, I'm gonna wait until the train goes by. Should you remove manure from paddocks after each rotation? Should you drag, harrow, those kind of things? I'm seeing some no faces in the audience out here. Yeah. It really depends, and I hate to say that because it's kind of a cop-out, but it does depend. If you are intensively stocked or you have just exercise areas, again, I don't want to single out horse people, but if you are keeping horses, let's say, in an area that is not going to provide the feed for them, it's just to get them out of around the stall in the sacrifice area. Picking your manure can be a good thing to do if you can swing it, and that's just because likely you don't have enough grass growing out there to really take up the nutrients that you're putting down in the manure in the yard. So that would be best case scenario. Should you drag or harrow? That is, ideally, most folks can benefit from that. A lot of reasons. Breaks up the parasite cycle. Of course, if you have long enough rotations, you can take care of it that way too. But just another check on that. Distributes nutrients a little bit more evenly so they're not just clumped where they've been deposited. So it can be, a benefit regardless kind of your circumstance. But again, it's a question of management. If you're going to not do anything because you're like, oh my goodness, I have to harrow and I'm not going to do it, forget about it. Try something first and get it down and then come back to it and try and work it in later. Any other questions, Gwen?
No.
Okay. Grazing triggers. I have to do a time check. I think I'm good. Okay, so beginning grazing height will depend on your species. Typically between 8 to 12 inches is ideal. It depends on what the livestock, what their grazing preference is, what your tolerance is for letting it grow, how easily, you could mow it, all those pieces. But 8 to 12, somewhere in that range. On the question of when will you decide not to graze, I moved this up. Saturated soil, dormant grass, not enough regrowth in the fields equals no grazing. Don't go out there if you can help it. And that's important. I mean, I know it's enticing to get livestock on green grass, but once you understand that you gotta manage your grass as well as you're managing your livestock, or think about it the same way. You really want to set it up for the best production it can give you, and that may require just leaving it alone for a little bit. All right, and then on how much will you take, kind of the old standard is take half, leave half. That can fluctuate depending on your system. Really, the reason for not grazing much more than a half, unless you're going to leave it for a pretty long period of time, is because of some studies done, I think in the mid 20th century, that showed response, a root growth response, as in it stopping if you graze much more than half of the plant. It basically goes into shock and stops growing. So you want to try and stay as close to that half as you can. That gives you a good amount of production. And then at least 3 inches at all times, at least 3 inches. 3 inches. How many inches? 3 inches. 4 to 6 sometimes, yeah, if you listen to the pasture calendar. And then monitoring could be, you know, whatever works for you. Calendar, a notebook, photos, from our example the first time around, your hay bill, if that was something you're trying to address. It could be any number of things. Again, there's a grazing chart here on the right-hand side, and we're going to see a better example of that right now. So after you've developed your plan, you've spent a season kind of trying to implement it, and maybe you don't do every single thing that you've written down, but that's okay because it's a process. At the end of the season, you should kind of sit down, reflect, and then plan how you're going to adapt to anything that may have cropped up during the season, whether that was just an unrealistic expectation on your part about what you were going to be able to do, or not accounting for pasture condition, or whatever it happens to be. But then go through questions that might look familiar. How was the growing season and forage production? How did this year's production match the last 3 years? How does the grazing intensity look to what I'm trying to do? And what do I need to graze less? What do I need to graze more intensively? And those questions were earlier on, and there's something you could come back to time on year on year and assess how you're doing. And then I gave this grazing chart a lot of screen space because I think it is awesome. Whoever put this together was doing an awesome job. So you can see, I'm trying to get my cursor up here. The black squares are basically how long the livestock were on the pasture. You can see they've written in when they clipped or mowed the pasture. You can see they put in dates for how long rest they got off each paddock. But even more than that, they've put in graduation dates, 20th wedding anniversary. Yeah, just all kinds of, you can tell that this is probably hung up, you know, by the back door where they can just fill it in. It functions as their calendar that they would keep for anything else. I think it's just a really cool example. Not that you have to go to this much depth, but just that it can be something that you kind of embed in your process. So, and then the power of photos, not really going to talk a whole lot about this other than to say, look at some pretty photos. You see some examples of different grazing management techniques. I love the horse one with some great grass going on. But the other piece of this is just that I, you know, will occasionally meet people through this line of work who say, oh my goodness, you know, I've worked with so-and-so, or I just, you know, really started reading and improving my pastures, and I'm so happy with the way things have turned out. And I'll say, oh, that's awesome. Did you take any pictures? And they will say no. And I'm inspired by what they're doing, and I would love to be able to see it. And I think it would be pretty powerful if they were able to see it too, kind of look back and say, wow, you know, I really did come a long way. Or, oh, you know, I see a lot more weeds maybe I wasn't, you know, paying attention to, or just whatever it happens to be that you have a reference point, kind of an objective reference point on. So, our photos. All right, on to the third subject.
Hey, Robin?
Yes.
Two questions, or one question and one comment here.
Sure.
The comment is, thank you for the grazing chart with the notes. They really like that.
Yeah, I did too. I thought that was cool.
And the question, and this goes back to paddocks again, is can you put chickens in after for spreading manure?
Sure. Yeah. Can you do leader follower style grazing? Yeah, that can work. Yeah, definitely can work. I'd say it becomes a little bit more tricky to manage what the chickens do to your stubble height after you've brought the grazing animal through, and they're adding a fair amount of nutrient on. Did everybody hear that question? I'm sorry, I didn't repeat that. Okay. And then we've got a not a rebuttal, but an add-on from somebody in our audience. Yeah. Yeah. Misha, who's here from Bright-Eyed Acres, is saying they do pasture poultry. Is saying it makes sense to wait a few days on the grazing animal after the poultry to follow. So you let the parasites start to develop and hatch so that the chickens can actually do their work as far as eating and digesting. Yeah, definitely can be done. It's just it's another complication to the management, right? It's that next step that you have to be ready for. And then you said you had another question?
Nope, that was it.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Sure. We are going to get to that. The dragging piece, not so much, but dragging ideally would be after every rotation. I think some level of dragging is better than no level of dragging. And then mowing, we're going to talk about a little bit more specifically in a second. Anybody else? Moving on. Feed your forages. Okay, another little detour. You saw T-Sum 200 come up. I know this is a little bit of a busy slide, but I think it's an important component to consider, and it's one of those pieces that when you're in late January, early February, and you're dreaming about the spring, you can track to see just when it's coming and not have to listen to a groundhog. So T-Sum 200 is basically, well, first of all, what it is, it's a repeatable method of determining when forage growth begins increasing. And it is essentially just an accumulation of heat units, is what they call it, or growing degrees is another term that's used in other crops. Really what it is average air temperature, to make it really simple. And you can see an example of what that looks like. I had started to track it for our February 5th class, and it looked like we were just about there. And then we got the weather we did. So we're still a little behind the threshold for T-Sum. But basically, and it's easiest in Celsius, you can do it in Fahrenheit, but you take the maximum and the minimum, add them together, divide them by 2, and that gives you your heat unit for that day. So the first we had 3 units, second we had 3, third we had 9. So in those first 3 days we had 15 of our 200 units. And then the idea being, once you've kind of gotten to those 200 units, the soil temperature is warmed up and stabilized, and microbes have become, acclimatized to that and active, and are minimizing soil nutrients, and things are starting to happen. And you can find, I think it's fun if you want to calculate it yourself. There is WSU's Ag WeatherNet is a great resource. If you go on there under summary reports, growing degree days, base temp 32, you can just track it. There's a weather station in Puyallup that will give you this number as we go through the season, so you don't have to calculate it. The cautions are, doesn't mean you should spread nutrients or be driving equipment on saturated soil, which we will typically have around this time of year. So it can be hard to really take advantage of that rate when we hit T-Sum 200. But and then it's best on well-producing fields that can be grazed early in the season. Otherwise, you're going to apply a whole bunch of nutrients. You're going to grow a lot of grass, and that's going to overmature, and you're going to waste everything that you just did. So, and then you don't need to apply. You never really need to apply your whole season's worth of nitrogen at once, but you definitely only want to do a small quarter to half of your nutrient needs to accommodate that spring growth as it's coming on. Yeah, when you start counting from, yeah. I'm going to take some water here. Excuse me. Okay, enough about that. So first, for feeding your forage, first you got to know what you have in the bank, so to speak. What do you have soil nutrient wise? So you got to sample your soil. Now, why are you going to do that? Mainly to establish your baseline nutrient status, quote unquote. Just figuring out where you're at right now. And that may take a couple soil samples to really establish that trend. The results are going to vary a little bit each time. And so it really takes 2 or 3 times to start to get a good sense of what you have out in the soil. Helps you determine application rates on nutrients you may need, assess pH and your need for liming, and then as one of those monitoring tools you can use going forward if it's part of your plan. And a funny cartoon. So, soil sampling, how do you go about doing it? Well, each sample should represent no more than 20 acres. Each single sample, so each bag that you send to the lab should be made up of 15 to 20, ideally, subsamples of that less than 20 acre area. So you go run around, find your favorite spots in the pasture randomly, 15 or 20 times, put it in a bucket, mix it up, and then take about 2 cups out of that bucket to make your one sample. I hope that's clear. Sample depth should be 6, 8, or 12 inches deep. There's kind of some variance depending on the guidance that you look at. Recommend 12 inches deep and sticking to whatever you choose. If you choose 6 inches, stick with 6 inches. If you change, that's going to change the reported amount of nutrients. 12 inches, I like in particular, depth of a shovel, more or less, and fall nitrate tests, which we'll talk about in a second, are based on 1 foot samples. And then submit, with enough lead time, basically, before don't expect to take the sample, send it, and fertilize the next day. Give yourself enough time for the lab to process, which will usually take about 2 weeks. I can send these out too if you want. Yeah. Or you can call us. So we're happy to come out and take samples. And historically, we've had First One's free soil sampling program. So if you've never sampled through us before, we can come out and take a sample, send it off to the lab, standard sample. Now we do up to 5 standard soil samples for folks. So if you want to take advantage of that, reach out to any one of our farm team. Good question. Standard sample is organic matter, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, calcium, pH, nitrate, and sulfur. And cation exchange capacity, but that doesn't really matter. I mean, it does matter, but you're not going to change it. So, just another way to look at how to take a soil sample, so you can see in the composite sampling approach, if you had a situation like that picture there on the left, where you have these very visibly different areas, you would kind of break them up and sample each of those individually. I had a much more in-depth slide that I decided to cut down on this, that you could go further depending on your soil type in each one of those fields. Maybe it bisects a field and you want to sample each one of those halves differently, or into separate samples. And then a graphic on just what we talked about before, less than 20 acres, kind of walk around in a random zigzag pattern, avoid areas where nutrients may concentrate or where they may be devoid, just out of the norm areas, so that you're not skewing the results. An example, we have a hand probe and an auger, and I like a shovel, solid steel shovel, and you can sample with any one of them. You don't need special equipment. If you sample with the shovel, you want to take kind of a core of that slice that you've taken, so that you're getting the whole profile that you sampled, and then mixing it all together again. Do you have a question?
Are you talking from the surface down to 6 inches or 8 inches or 12 inches?
Yeah.
Include some of that whole core?
Yes. Yeah. So you would go down to whatever your depth is going to be, and then there's you know, the sod. If depending on what you have up top, you want to take off the highly organic matter portion right off the top, and any grass or whatever that gets in, try and keep those pieces out. When do you want to sample? I would, for pastures, would mostly recommend fall, and that's for a couple reasons. One, because not unlike crop scenarios where there's very specific, you know, you're going to plant in the spring, and you want to know what your nutrient status is before you plant. You can pick a time of the year that's going to give you a sense of your nutrients, and then just sample at that time of year every year, and they shouldn't change too much year on year as far as variability, just due to weather. So, and the other piece is it informs liming rates, and it plays into your report card nitrate tests, again, which we'll talk about in a second. Just basically tells you how well you did on nitrogen management in the season before, which isn't a whole lot of help for that last season, but it can inform the decisions you make for next season. Spring, you can do, and it depends, you know, maybe if you're going to renovate, you could do in spring more in-season nutrient needs. You're going to miss out on the timeliness of that information around liming time, which is in the fall, and the report card nitrogen test. And then you should sample every 3 years, every fall, ideally for nitrate. More frequently if you are just starting to sample, or if you are, well, mostly if you're just starting to sample, because it's going to take a while for you to figure out what the numerous tests that you've taken, how they kind of balance out, because some will be a little bit higher, some will be a little bit lower, and you won't really know until you've taken a few of them. And if you wait 3 years between each one of them, you could be waiting a decade before you kind of figure out what that trend is. Can't really act on it very quickly. So more frequently, moral of the story, and then you should do it before you seed or renovate. And I had some questions actually on this. I wanted to see, make sure I didn't miss here. I think I have hit those ones so far. Oh, there's a question about, are there any nutrients that are commonly lacking in pasture in the greater Puyallup area? We have a lot of phosphorus in a lot of places, mostly due to historic dairying in this area. pH on the west side of the mountains tends to be low because of the amount of rain that we get, so lime is something you have to consider pretty regularly. Nitrate to the nitrogen that's going to feed your grass is going to get flushed out by all that rain too every season, and so you have to address that. Those are kind of the main ones, and then potassium and magnesium and sulfur. Magnesium, or rather sulfur, is also can get leached out, and so that's something you have to address periodically. Potassium, magnesium, and calcium tend to be just depends on the situation, I guess. Taking the sample, you bagged it up, you're ready to send it off, or we have done it for you. Bunch of labs that you can go to, kind of like the soil sampling depth. It's best to pick one and stick to it, because they'll all be just a little bit different, and if you send one to one lab and one to another lab, they're not going to give you the same results. So that's fine, because they tend to be internally consistent, and so if you stick with them, unless you have any reason not to, you should be able to judge, you know, year to year what changes are going on. And then we use A&L West Laboratories out of Portland and Modesto. But like I say, there's a bunch of other labs that you can go through. Taking
Rob, one question.
Yeah.
Do you plant a cover crop every winter to help with nitrogen levels?
Do you plant a cover crop? There are more people who are incorporating kind of annual fodder crops. I would maybe call them more than cover crops in that situation. You can do. You could also interseed clover. We're actually working on a pasture innovation trial right now with WSU that's looking at the best ways to get clovers and other grasses established in existing pasture. So yes, you could do that. As far as every year, I don't think for most folks that might be a lot of management for the benefit. I think it just depends on what your goal is. Again, if your goal is to have a source of high protein feed at a time that you wouldn't normally get it from grass, that can be really good. If it's just because you heard it was a good, I shouldn't say that, that sounds a little bit dismissive, but just if you think it sounds like a good idea, know why you're doing it, I guess is how I would frame that. All right, soil test interpretation. So you've taken the sample, you've sent it off to the lab, they've given it back to you or back to us. And if so, you won't have to worry about any of this. Well, sorry, we'll try and work with you so you understand it as we're going through the process. But if you haven't done it through us, you'd want to know what to do next. So the interpretation portion is, okay, what elements am I going to need? What soil nutrients do I need? How much of it do I need? What am I going to get it from? What type of fertilizer? What type of application? When to apply it? And will I get a return on my investment? This is commonly called the 4 R's of nutrient management, which is a little bit of a cop-out because right each time is not actually the actionable component of that. So right source, right rate, right time, right place. Okay. So we are going to walk through at a blisteringly high speed soil sample. Both because I'm running short of time a little bit and because it's just the example that I have. But that being said, my colleague Allie Nichols, who is our crop specialist here at the district, is going to be hosting a workshop with Andy Berry from WSU on specifically focusing on organic nutrient sources. There's a little bit more management that goes on with organic nutrient sources, and that's coming up on March 5th. So register for her class if this gets you interested, but didn't answer all your questions, so you can go through that. I will at least try to give you a start on where you would do, and then we could work together if you have more questions. Okay, so from A&L Lab, this is what the test results look like. They look different depending on the lab you get them back from. Basically a table that lists out those nutrients that we talked about before. So this is the standard sample. This is the report you get back from it. And you can see you've got organic matter, you've got 2 different ratings of phosphorus. Typically on the west side, we use P1, weak bray, and then the rest of your nutrients. So you've got this report back. And then you can go to a publication. The one for our neck of the woods is Nutrient Management for Pastures in Western Oregon, Western Washington. It is also over on the table, and I can send it out to folks. But it will give you a sense of what ranges you should be aiming for each of those nutrients. So for phosphorus, we're looking around 30. Potassium, we're looking around 200. Magnesium over 100, calcium over 100. These are all kind of sufficiency bases. And then pH 5.8 to 7, depending on the crop that you're growing. Legumes, so clovers are going to respond. They're going to not like as acidic conditions as grass is going to be able to tolerate. So if you want more clovers in your pasture, pH is definitely something that you're going to want to pay attention to. And then nitrogen and sulfur. Nitrogen, like I said, in the fall is the time to do it. Around the time this sample was taken, you can see it's around the end of September, and that's the time it's going to give you the best information. Otherwise, it's not actually really that helpful. But at this time of year, if you get a sample, it should be between 10 and 30 parts per million. Too much, you applied too much nutrient and wasted money, and have a potential water quality concern if you continue to do that for a long period of time. And then too little, obviously, you could have probably gotten more from your grass if it would have had more nitrogen available. Sulfur, somewhat similar, 10 to 20. So from that, we can see we've got, our soil organic matter is high, but pretty typical actually for this particular soil type. pH is very high. Potassium is moderate. Magnesium is a little bit low, right on the edge. Calcium's moderate. pH is low. Nitrate is low. Sulfur is low. And so once we know that, we can refer to the guidance that the land-grant university have, spent years researching. And these are tables from this publication that's on the table over there to give you a sense of, okay, we have less than 100 parts per million phosphorus, potassium. What should we be applying? And it'll give you the range that you should apply within. So that's kind of the basic component of it. And then same for lime applications, depending on the level your lime's at now and the soil buffer index. You get two numbers for pH. The buffer is basically how responsive is it going to be to lime application. You can look to this, and we're at 6.1 here. 6.1 into an established field. We're looking at a top dress of about 2 tons of lime per acre. Any questions on those pieces we're on to?
Question.
Sure.
Specific to lime.
Mm-hmm.
You get the powdered lime, you get lime sand.
Mm-hmm. Different.
Lime sand on, and got a love note from the water quality people. Tacoma.
Really?
Uh-huh. My nitrates went way up.
Interesting. Do you know anything about that?
Was it?
Nitrate. Yeah. Yeah. That's the question here was between different lime sources, whether you're using a powder or more of a granular, coarser material, lime sand. And did you have an analysis? Like,
Yes.
Was there a, yeah, nothing? Yeah. This gentleman was having a particular issue where there was some thought that it might be affecting his nitrate numbers. That would be very, very unlikely. So typically the difference between the materials is a finer ground. It's actually scored, so their calcium carbonate equivalent, or sieve score, is going to indicate how reactive it's going to be, how quickly it's going to react in the soil. And so finer is going to react more quickly. It's not going to have quite as long of an effect as a coarser material. There's also pelleted lime, which is just easier to handle as well. So that plays into it as well. Okay. So we've run through, we've kind of figured out where our nutrients are at in relationship to the levels that they should be. Consulted the land-grant university for recommendations on levels or elements that we need to get back up, and we've come to this conclusion of we need 120 pounds per acre potassium, 2 tons of lime, 75 pounds of nitrogen, which we'll talk about in a second, and about 12 pounds of sulfate. Oh, and this is just showing you the nitrate report card. More math. So I will try and do this justice. So we know that we need 120 pounds per acre of phosphorus. That's what, or of potassium. That's what the land-grant university guidance was showing us. And we have this fertilizer material, which is muriate of potash, 0060. And we want to figure out how much of that material do we need to supply that 120 pounds of potassium. Formula for that, very simple. One of the formulas you could use is the pounds recommended, or the pounds that you need, divided by the amount of nutrient in the fertilizer material times 100. That's because the number on the bag is a percentage of how much is in there. So if you have a 100-pound bag, 60 pounds of that is potassium, or K2O in this situation. So you can see the run through there on the bottom of the kind of mock-up fertilizer label. We needed 120. We divided it by 60, the amount in this particular fertilizer material, which came out to 2 times 100. That's 200 pounds per acre of potassium. Does that make sense? I mean, that's pretty straightforward math as far as, yeah, what you need. I'm going to skip calcium because we are running a little bit long. We didn't need it anyway, so that was just a bonus. Are folks all right if we run a little bit long? If you have to leave, I'm not going to be offended, but I will try and not rush too much. Gets a little bit more complicated when we're talking about multiple different amendments. So we figured out from the nitrogen guidance in that nutrient management in Western Oregon and Washington that we need about 75 pounds per acre based on the amount of production that we have. That incorporates kind of organic matter's contribution. That's hard to calculate depending on your situation. So they've got you close to the ballpark there. So we need 75 pounds per acre of N of nitrogen. Urea has 46 pounds in this 100-pound bag, let's say. So 75 divided by 46, 1.63, about 163 pounds. But we also needed sulfur. And the way we're going to apply sulfur doesn't have to be the way we're going to apply sulfur, but in this instance, we're going to use ammonium sulfate because it's easy to get and relatively cheap. So the complication there is if we apply ammonium sulfate, we've already reached all of our nitrogen amount from the urea, and now we're going to apply another 50 pounds from the ammonium sulfate. So we'd be over applying. It's a waste of money and a potential water quality concern. So instead, I'd recommend starting with that ammonium sulfate, or kind of the lower need, lower amount fertilizer that you're going to apply, and play around with these numbers. And again, we can work together when you run into questions. But in this case, we're going to apply based on the amount of sulfur that we need. So we needed 12 pounds of sulfur. This has 24 pounds per 100 pounds. That gets us to 50 pounds per acre of this ammonium sulfate. That 50 pounds is going to give us about 10.5 pounds of nitrogen. So we got to go back, subtract that from the amount we needed, which was 75 pounds of nitrogen. That now becomes 64.5 pounds, divided by the same 46 pounds in the bag of urea to get a total of 140. And that combination will reach both our sulfur needs and our nitrogen needs throughout the season. Don't put these on all at once, all at the same time. The idea would be, how much you need in total, and then you can start to parcel it out throughout the year. So, some in early spring to accommodate spring growth, some in the later spring to keep it growing, and then just a little bit in the fall to accommodate fall regrowth when kind of the rain returns. And then we're coming back to the Western Oregon and Washington pasture calendar. They have one of their appendix has kind of a schedule of when particular nutrients would typically be applied. So, so that's, you would plan it out like that. Mow to grow. Okay. We're getting to the last two pieces, and these are pretty short, so we'll be pretty close to on time. So nutrients, water, light, temperature will only get you so far. If the grass says it's time to stop growing, it's going to stop growing. So the solution is try not to give the grass the last say in a very, very brief primer on grass physiology. There's really three main phases that grass goes through, well, I guess grows through as it's growing, and that's vegetative, elongation, and reproduction. So the vegetation is really setting the power plant up for the grass plant, getting as much leaf mass on as it can. Elongation is those reproductive stems starting to lengthen out to support the seed head that they're going to produce. And then reproduction, of course, the production of seeds. And the grass is trying to get to that point. That's the end of its life, right? It wants to make seed and grow more grass later on. The problem with that is kind of twofold. One is you can see by this graph down here in the corner that as it is growing through those phases, the amount, the yield, the actual physical amount of plant that's out there is going up, but at some point the yield of that amount is going down because of change in nutrients in the grass itself, complex carbohydrates, stuff that is harder to digest for animals. So there's this kind of ideal point between the amount of yield that you're going to get and the amount of quality that it has that you want to shoot for. And so you may be getting lots of grass, but it's not totally digestible. And then the other piece is regrowth after reproduction is reduced, mostly because it's kind of achieved its life goals, and those reproductive stems are done. And so it'll grow back from another spot on that bunch plant, but it's going to be a reduced rate of growth. So if you can keep it within that, as you can see here, it says boot and stem elongation and vegetative phase, you're kind of in the sweet spot. But really, mowing? Everybody hates mowing. Everybody hates mowing their lawn. But it is a really, really good tool for a couple of reasons. The first is, like we talked about, that digestibility piece, that palatability piece. If you're, especially if you are in a selective grazing environment, horses are notorious for this, where they will graze down areas to the dirt, and then there'll be nice patches of really nice green grass out there that's over matured. And so this can help even those areas out. And if you combine that with not giving them the choice to selectively graze like that, you can avoid those situations and keep as much palatability as you can. And then it also maintains that vegetative grass growth as long as possible. So like we were saying, as it gets ahead of you in the spring, because that regrowth, or that regrowth period's that much shorter, if you let it go too long, it's going to get to that reproduction phase. Quality is going to drop. So you want to get out if you can, if the soil is not super wet, and mow it back and keep it vegetatively growing as much as you can. And then the last thing is it helps control weeds as well. It depends, it's a supplemental technique to other things you may have, especially other techniques you may use, especially if you have really problem weeds. But well-fertilized, well-managed grass is a really good competitor to most weeds. So when to mow, mowing for uniformity. So this is evening out those roughs and greens, those overgrazed versus undergrazed areas, ideally after east rotation. And you could do it less frequency. Again, it's more, or some is better than none. but ideally it would be after each rotation to just kind of even everything out. And you'd want to mow it down to whatever your stubble height is that you're choosing to graze to. So that might be 6 inches if you're grazing to 12, or no less than 3 to 4 inches. Mowing is for weed control, kind of depends on what you're trying to control. More perennial weeds, you know, you're hoping to sap their energy reserves over time by reducing the amount of biomass, or the amount of ability they have to capture light and make energy. And you can also, for less perennial weeds, take out the seed head before it develops and matures, so it can't spread more, at least. And again, that's similar. Mow down to whatever your chosen stubble height is, or at least no less than 3 to 4 inches. And then mowing for vegetative growth to sort of avoid that flush of green grass going to waste and getting over mature. You want to mow it anytime it's getting into the boot stage. You could probably let it go a little bit longer, but boot stage is a good indicator, and that's when the seed head is starting to push out of the leaf sheath. So as you're walking through the field, you can start to see that happen. And then it depends on the height that you want to mow to, depends on when you're able to get out there. If you're not going to be able to get out there for a while, you know, it might not matter what your stubble height is. You might want to mow it down to that 3 inches, so it's got longer to grow before you know you can get back out there.
Does that the half, the take half, leave half thing still fly when mowing?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Okay. The grass. Okay, so this is the last piece. Summer slump is basically that cliff the end of August and September when it's really dry around here.
Hey, Robin,
Yes.
can I ask 2 questions about the previous part really
Sure.
quickly?
Yeah.
One is, if you drag a pasture after grazing on a somewhat regular basis, would you still spread composted manure on it in the spring and or fall?
Depending on what your soil sample says and what your compost analysis says.
Okay.
So not as a matter of course. I wouldn't say just go out there and spread compost every year, kind of regardless. I would say take a soil sample, see if how much you're supplying through the feed that you're bringing on and is passing through the animals, and then decide if you need to, if anything the compost is going to give you is going to help your pasture.
Okay. And then the next question is there a growth chart that we can use per stages of grass, such as keeping grass in the main growing stage?
Are there growth charts? So like to see what it looks like throughout each stage, so you can kind of, I guess I would need a little bit more clarification on what the person is asking there. There are, I think Renee had something. No, okay. I mean, there's very simple, like I think the boot is probably one of the key indicators that you really need to know, because that's really indicating that jump from stem elongation to the reproductive phase. That's the piece that I would pay the most attention to. There are, and like for cereal grains, it's a big deal to know what particular phase of vegetation it's in, because there might be 5 of them. I don't know them off the top of my head, but that's less so, at least that I've found. Yeah. 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 Yeah, Renee's making a good point that, you know, it may be difficult, you know, maybe harder to know based on the different species, because they're going to look different at the same stage of maturity. And I don't know of any chart that'll show you, you know, lined up. Well, no, I could look. Do you know of any, Renee? Yeah. Okay. that would be another one. If that person wants to reach out to Renee or myself, or would be happy to follow up on that question.
Great, I'll let her know.
Okay. Last one. All right. So just some cool graphs that show you what the grass growth looks like over the course of a season, and that you can see very dramatically where it drops off. We will skip through most of this. This is going back to the pasture calendar, just describing what's happening at that time of year. And I think really the key piece here is to look at those dates on the bottom, and you can see there's a wide variability between up in the foothills down to prairie soils, when this dormancy is going to occur. And again, if you're new to an area or you've got different, soil moisture, soil water holding capacity soils on your property, this may be good for you to consider. So one of the key reasons for this is due to soil temperature. Moisture plays a role, but temperature also really plays into this. So between 42 and 52 degrees, grass is growing, but not super strongly. 52 to 62, it's growing really well. And then above 62, it starts to really shut down. Part of that, again, moisture, part of that microorganisms not tolerating the temperature very well, and roots not being able to do what they need to do. So really that above 62 degree soil temperature or average air temperature for a week, which are basically the same, is a key indicator to when that summer slump is going to come on. So in other words, time between 42 degrees and 60 degrees equals the time that the pasture is growing, equals where you want to be. That's a wine thermometer that just happens to have those temperatures mapped out on it. So you need help figuring out what your soil temperatures are. So we've kind of talked about, you can manage your plant growth based on the plant development managed by mowing or grazing. Soil fertility you can test for and then fertilize to amend. Soil moisture you can address by irrigation. Soil temperature, how do we do that? Well, by keeping at least 3 inches of snow on it. This is a trick slide, I guess. But really, it is the more biomass that you can leave on top of the soil, the better insulated it's going to be. And so it's able to buffer out the swings in temperature much better than if it's this tall, right? Because there's nothing there that's maintaining that temperature. And so that also comes back to that 4 to 6 inch suggestion on the rapid growth periods. You want to keep a little bit more as you're coming into this period so that you can maintain that insulation for as long as possible and keep it growing just as long as you can before it will eventually, depending on where you're at, most likely go dormant. So, it's also setting a solid foundation for next year. Keeping the soil covered is going to keep you cooler and moisture in the summer, keep the plants growing longer. That's what we just talked about. It's also going to keep the soils warmer in winter and keep the plants growing longer into fall. And then the plants are going to start growing sooner in spring because the soil's going to be warmer to start with. That's it. So we've covered all those bases. I'm not even going to read back through them. If there's any last questions, I just wanted to leave this quote here that I found from a guy who works at NRCS that says, "Plant only fence post for the first 3 years after changing grazing." A lot of times people want to go out and renovate their pastures or make really extreme changes without realizing that it's going to take time for those management changes that you make to really show themselves in the pasture. Because it took a while for it to get to that condition. It's going to take as much or more time to get. That's it. Yeah. 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 AWHC, we'll just go back to that, is available water holding capacity. So that's basically showing the difference between a soil that's able to hold on to moisture really well and a soil that's not able to hold on to moisture. And that's just other questions? I'm sorry, I went over by 15 minutes, but any questions on the call, Glenn?
Not specific ones, just requests for the handouts, worksheets and Excel templates
I
to
will,
be sent out. And actually the slides,
yeah, I can
is
send
that
out.
possible?
Yep. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. And then I'm recording this, so with
Okay.
luck, it will work. And you can have the recording of it to post on your website if you want to do that.
Awesome. Cool. Well, I guess if nobody else has any questions, that's it. Gwen, thank you so much for moderating on your side, and thank you to everybody who was out there on the call. And I hope to meet up with you folks, or you contact Renee or Paul at some point. And thank you guys for being here. Appreciate it.